This is part 2 of our YZ250F top end rebuild. If you need help with disassembly, make sure to check out part 1. Now that we have our top end out and our cam chain removed, we can go through and clean all of our mating surfaces and our parts for inspection. This is also when you'd want to make your parts list on what stuff you need to replace. To start our assembly, we want to check out our crankshaft cam chain teeth for any abnormal wear, threads, your keyway. We can move up to the crankshaft. Now on the crankshaft, you want to look for some side-to-side play, not too excessive. You can check each side with a feeler gauge. There's a spec in your manual, but you absolutely want no up and down play. This crankshaft is nice and tight. You want to check the inside of your small end bearing for any galling or discoloration there. I like to take the new piston pin and slide that through there with a little oil and kind of get an idea on that. You don't want any up and down play in there, but you want it to move freely. Now we need to measure our cylinder and check with our OEM service manual to see if it's within spec. If you need help with this, check out our How to Measure a Cylinder video. Okay, let's take a look at the cylinder. I want to point out a few things. You can see down here that this is very smooth and very little crosshatch. Up here you can see there's still some crosshatch, and then there's some really light vertical marks. This bike was burning oil, and that's the main reason, is there was no crosshatch. So you're going to want to run a ball hone through there to get fresh crosshatch so that your new piston rings will seat. If you don't do this, the new rings won't seat and you will continue to burn oil. So next I'll take my ball hone, I'll put a little lubricant on there. Want to lightly put it in and go back and forth real lightly. Now you can see that we have fresh crosshatch throughout the whole cylinder, and you want to make sure that it's evenly everywhere. After we get our cylinder honed, we're going to check our piston and ring end gap. Your piston kit should come with a reference chart for specifications on ring end gap, etc. This piston has one compression ring and one oil ring. Well, it's comprised of two thin rings and a wafer-like ring, and then you have your compression ring. Some have two compression rings, this one only has one. Your compression ring will always have a letter or number that always faces up. Now let's check our ring end gap. So you want to stick it in slightly, be very careful with it. Use the piston and push it down so that the ring is nice and level with the cylinder bore. Then you just take your feeler gauge and you check the gap. Take your measurement and refer to your piston instructions. Now most piston kits come with the ring end gap already adjusted, but it's a good idea to double check that before you install it. Now if your ring end gap is not within spec, there's two things you can do. If it's too big, you need to double check your measurements, but you may need to replace your cylinder. Now if it's too tight, you can use a fine-tooth file or a sanding disc to get it within spec. You may need to check it a few times while doing this process. As you do this, just make sure that you remove any burrs. Before we install one of our circlips, I want to talk about the top of the piston. There's always an indication mark on the exhaust side. It's either an arrow or a dot. That's always on the exhaust side, so because these are directional, you don't want to put this in backwards, as your exhaust valves will have interference, or intake will have interference with the top of your piston. If it's a smooth face, it still could interfere, but just make sure that you always have the reference dot facing to the exhaust, unless your instructions say otherwise. Next, let's install our circlip into our piston. Now these can be pretty difficult to do, so take your time and be careful. You don't want to bend it. Grab some needle nose and grab the one side of the circlip and take the other side and stick it into the recess into the piston, and using your thumb in a twisting motion, slowly twist it and push it in. Sometimes you need a flathead screwdriver to help push it in as well. Now in this bike, when you install your circlip, you need to make sure the open-end gap is at least 3 millimeters away from the cutout on the piston. A good general practice is to install it 180 degrees from the cutout. Now let's install our oil ring. Take the wafer-looking ring first. Now your ring end gap, you want to alternate those so that they're away from each other. Check your service manual for specific instructions on proper piston ring end positioning. With your oil ring, you want to do one on the bottom, your wafer ring, and then one on the top. But you need to install the wafer ring first and then the top and bottom ring. So you slide that in, and then work your way around. Be careful not to bend them or break them. And then make sure that it moves freely, like you can squeeze it in and out and rotate it. Now remember, the mark on the piston ring needs to be installed facing up. Just be very careful with these. I always start with the end in first, in the groove, and then I'll slowly work it around. If you pull it out too far, you could break it. If you try and press it over the side, it could bend or break it. So if you just slightly work it around, it doesn't put a lot of tension on the piston ring and it will go on nicely. Now let's install our piston. Use a little assembly lube on your piston pin. Now we'll put our piston pin in part of the way and we'll slide it right on and slide it in. Now let's install our circlip. Next, let's remove our paper towel. Be careful not to let the crankshaft rod hit the side of the case. And then we will install our dowel pins and our base gasket. Now let's put a little assembly lube on the skirt and install our cylinder. Now when you're installing your cylinder, you got to compress your piston rings in so that it will slide into the bore. Just be very careful here. This is real tedious. Take your time. Now let's install our cylinder bolt. Don't torque it, just do it hand tight. Now let's install our cam chain and use your wire to wire it out of the way. Then let's install your cam chain guides. Let's apply a little medium strength thread locker and torque this to 7.2 foot-pounds. And now the other chain slider, make sure that it sits in both of its grooves, upper and lower. After we install the cam chain, let's install the dowel pins and head gasket. Now we can install the cylinder head. To make this easier, you may need another set of hands to help you out with this. If you don't have any friends, ask your mom. Now let's install our cylinder bolts. I just take a little engine oil, put it on our threads, and drop them in. Make sure you have your washers installed on each bolt before you install it. Then screw on the cylinder nuts. Now let's torque the cylinder head down using Yamaha's torque pattern. We are going to torque these in 2 steps. First, let's torque the head bolts to 15 foot-pounds. Then the side nuts at 4 foot-pounds. After that, let's torque the head bolts to 24 foot-pounds. And then the side bolts at 7.2 foot-pounds. Be sure to follow Yamaha's torque procedures for these steps. Now that we've torqued the side nuts, let's torque the cylinder nut to 7.2 foot-pounds. Now let's head back down to installing the stator cover. Let's start with installing the flywheel. Now be careful to line up the keyway with the inside of the flywheel. And your washer and nut. Now let's torque the flywheel nut to 47 foot-pounds. Next, install your dowel pins and stator cover gasket. And now the side cover. And now our side cover bolts. Torque these bolts to 7.2 foot-pounds in a crisscross pattern. Then we can use a wrench to rotate the motor to top dead center. Next, let's move to the cylinder head. We can start by applying assembly lube to the exhaust camshaft. Then we can install it. After, we can do the same thing to the intake cam. We want to make sure the individual dots on the camshaft line up with the plane on the cylinder head. I always like to double check this step because if it's done wrong, it could cause serious damage. Be sure to reference your service manual for timing instructions on your machine. Now let's install the camshaft caps, starting with the alignment clip, 2 dowel pins, and install the cap. Now our service manual says to torque these in 2 to 3 steps. So first we're going to torque these at 4 foot-pounds following Yamaha's torque pattern. Now go back and retorque them to 7.2 foot-pounds, again following the proper procedure. Now let's install the cam chain tensioner, starting with the gasket. Insert a small flat blade screwdriver and turn clockwise to back off the tensioner. Install the tensioner and the 8mm bolts. Now torque these to 7.2 foot-pounds and slowly back off your screwdriver and remove it and install your access plug. At this point we need to double check our timing. We're going to slowly turn the motor over a couple of times with the kickstart lever, and then we'll put the motor back to top dead center compression. Then double check the marks on the camshaft to make sure that they still line up. If they don't, then we need to repeat our timing procedure. Now let's install our timing plugs, spark plug, and valve cover. I like to use a little Yamaha bond on the valve cover seal. Now be careful not to cross thread your spark plug when installing it, and then we want to torque it to 9.4 foot-pounds. Now let's add some oil and coolant. Make sure to install your coolant lines before adding coolant. Now the reason we're doing this now is because if we're going to have an exterior leak, hopefully we see it before we get the bike reassembled. Now that we've got the top end together, the bike's ready for reassemble the same way we took it apart. Make sure to follow your service manual for proper reassembly procedures. Once you get the bike back together, go ahead and start it. If it doesn't start, double check everything and try again. Now Yamaha recommends the break-in procedure by staying under half throttle for the first 30 minutes. After that, we can finish installing the shrouds, airbox cover, and finally the seat. And that's it. That's how you rebuild the top end on your YZ250F. Come check us out at RockyMountainatvmc.com for more parts, apparel, and accessories. And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. This is Steve. Catch you next time.